There are a number of reasons for doing a talk on cultural perspectives. The main reason is that culture means many things to many different people, and in policy analysis, culture can also often turn into a kind of black box where you plug in the behaviors that you can't fit into your model of guns and money, your model of people responding to economic and political pressures. And I'd like to think that we can theorize culture a little more deeply than that, and in doing so we can actually produce better policy analysis than we can by treating culture as the leftover when you've dealt with the political and the economic and the geographic and the historical. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and cultural anthropology, as I understand it, is the comparative study of common sense. By common sense, I mean that set of unstated assumptions that we share with others in our community that we can most rely on in making sense of the world around us. It's what we accept to be true without questioning, without analyzing it. Common sense doesn't need explanation because common sense is the explanation. We guarantee the truth of something by saying that it's just common sense. This is a problem for international social relations because different communities have different common senses that work equally well in each one's physical and social environments. So as economic, political, and environmental processes bring into contact people who operate according to different common senses, cultural misunderstandings occur. In what follows, I want to suggest that culture is a fundamental human trait. It is something that people have that identifies them to themselves and others as a particular kind of people, but also that it is something that is generated through encounters. And I'll take each of these separately. In saying that culture is a fundamental human trait, I'm saying that the capacity to create culture is fundamentally human. To be human is to need to live in a world of meanings. To be able to act effectively in the universe, people have to construct models of how the world works, values that help them decide what goals are worth pursuing, and plans of action that help them achieve those goals. In thinking about culture as fundamentally human, consider the fact that all animals eat, but only humans have meals. That is, they have social meanings to their food. They sharing a meal, preparing a meal versus buying a meal. There are entire sorts of foods that we culturally bracket as non-foods, so that even though we live in a niche where we might be able to eat a number of different kinds of things, we forbid them. We don't eat worms, we don't eat insects, we don't eat pork, we don't eat beef. All of these kinds of things are ways of saying that food has meanings for us, and that it's part of our fundamental orientation towards the world and towards each other. Similarly, we can say that all animals mate, but only humans marry. Humans make distinctions between who one can have sex with and who one cannot have sex with. We surround the process of mating with rituals and with values, with moral obligations and legal obligations and social obligations. As a result of all that mating, all animals produce offspring, but only humans have families. Only humans recognize their offspring and give them names and give them responsibilities and rights, and on the basis of their descent and their sex, treat them differently. All of which goes to show that even things as basic as eating and mating and having offspring is for human beings not instinctual but deeply, deeply cultural. What's so interesting about this is that all humans don't live in the same world of meanings. Different groups of humans generate and elaborate different systems of meaning. And to the extent that these systems are shared among sets of people, they define groups as communities. Individuals in communities create their own unique ways of acting, and they do so within a horizon of meanings that's defined by the community. Growing up in these communities, we tend to imagine that the ways that we think and act and feel are fundamentally human, that they are the natural way of behaving. And we usually continue to believe this until we encounter people who have fundamentally different ways of relating to the world. We imagine that our way of living in our bodies, our way of touching others, our way, how close we stand to people, how we articulate our language, how we experience the world is universally human until we find people who experience the world differently and articulate their words differently and touch differently and stand in proximity to others differently. And we realize that the things we thought were natural and universal are in fact cultural. Except when we don't. And one of the most important things about these kinds of difference is that humans will often engage in conflict to maintain the reality of their worldview rather than acknowledge the plurality of possible ways of being in the world. And this is a really important aspect of culture for the kinds of things that we're looking at when we do policy analysis. There are many ways to define culture, and I'm not going to do that here. Instead, what I want to talk about is sort of 4 basic traits that all anthropologists agree that culture has. In this sense, culture can be said to be symbolic, it's shared, it's learned, and it's adaptive, and I'll take each of these separately. Everything humans produce, from words to gestures to clothes to housing to complex technologies, are symbols. To say that culture is symbolic is to say that it communicates things to others about us. Not only what we say, but how we say it, intonation, volume, and pitch, communicates important information about us and what we might be thinking or feeling or about to do. The same is true of the kinds of clothes we wear, or how we cut our hair, or how close we stand to people, or how we eat our food. Even the most practical of actions possesses a symbolic communicative element. And it's because we share a common set of understandings about what symbols mean that we can understand and predict one another's actions and so cooperate as a community. However, to say that culture is symbolic is also to say that culture is arbitrary. One of the most important things about culture is that symbols usually have no intrinsic or essential relationship to the things that they stand for. For example, there's absolutely nothing in the phonetic sounds of the words horse, or Hassan, or equus, or cheval that connects them with the particular animal to which they all refer. The relationship between those verbal signs and their quadruped referent is arbitrary. We only know the meaning of the word if we've grown up in a community that shares the knowledge of which symbols refer to which things. These dimensions all work together. So we can say that culture is symbolic in that culture operates through symbols, including language, objects, gestures, sounds, etc. Because it operates through symbols, it's communicative, which means that everything that we do as members of a society has a cultural meaning as well as whatever practical functions our actions might have. And the meanings of symbols are arbitrary, which means that the symbols through which we communicate are particular to people who learned them by sharing common experiences. This brings us to the next aspect of culture, the fact that culture is shared. Culture involves shared understandings of symbols and their meanings that allow us to communicate, to cooperate, to predict, and to understand one another's actions. And yet, while culture is shared, it is not equally distributed to all the members of a society. Different distributions of cultural knowledge usually serve to produce and maintain differences in social positions. Your experience of the world will be different depending on your sex, your race, your caste, your class, your age. In highly complex societies, These differences can also distinguish people on the basis of education or occupation or even how they use their leisure time. We call these subcultural systems microcultures, distinct patterns of learned and shared behavior and thought that coexist within larger cultural systems. And any given individual may occupy many microcultures. And so we tend to see them as a series of overlapping nodes. The existence of microcultures means that there are differences of belief and behavior within social systems as well as between them. We need to make ourselves the same so we can live together and predict what we will and won't do. And so one of the things that we have to do is manage differences so that they don't get out of hand and threaten the status quo. Some of these systems are oppressive, some of them less so. We define people as different, too different and therefore criminal, or too different and therefore possessed of a jinn or a demon, or too different and therefore crazy and in need of being locked up. The existence of difference, then, opens up the possibilities for various configurations of power. In most societies, rights, responsibilities, and control over resources are unequally distributed to people on the basis of social categories like race and class and caste and sex and so on. So differences, that is any meaningful social distinction, and the meaningfulness is itself a cultural distinction, often lead to hierarchies, that is, situations in which the social distinction becomes the basis for inequality. And so difference in a cultural system can become the basis for power relations. This is true between societies as well as within them. The fact that not all cultural knowledge is equally shared by all the members of a society draws our attention to the fact that we don't simply possess culture by virtue of being born into a society. We learn our culture. We learn it as we live and work and grow. Which aspects of our society's total cultural repertoire we learn, that is, which microcultures we belong to, depends to a large extent on our unique experiences growing up. And yet those experiences aren't totally unique because they're always in turn shaped by society. Insofar as we're raised in similar ways and pass through similar institutions like hospitals and schools and weddings and funerals, we come to share common sets of cultural knowledge and values and assumptions. Insofar as our experiences differ because of unusual family structures, differences in wealth, exposure to different areas of society, our cultural knowledge will be different. One aspect of these processes of learning is what we call formal learning, the acquisition of cultural knowledge that takes place within institutions that are specifically designed for the learning process, such as schools or apprenticeships or on-the-job training. Every society has some institutions that exist primarily to pass on to children specific skills that they need as adult members of that society. But formal learning makes up only a small part of the cultural learning process. Most cultural learning takes place through processes of informal learning, the learning that we engage in simply by watching and listening and participating in everyday activities. Consider how you learned to speak, how you learned your taste in clothes, how you learned your eating habits. These things are usually learned through observation and imitation and gauging the responses of the people around us to our everyday behaviors. Our deepest cultural learning even shapes our bodies and our unconscious behaviors. It affects how we speak, how we move, how we eat, how close we stand to people, how we touch. This kind of cultural learning is called embodiment. And one of the things that happens with embodiment is embodied learning is often the kind of thing that makes us the most uncomfortable when we encounter difference. If you grow up in a society where men don't touch, for example, then it is very disturbing to find yourself in a society where men do touch and kiss and embrace. Same thing is true of many other forms of culture, of embodied culture. And yet, in spite of how deep culture can go, down to the point where it shapes our bodies and our emotions, culture is not only capable of changing, but is always in a process of change. Cultural learning doesn't only refer to the process whereby children become socially adept members of a community. Cultural learning is a lifelong process because cultural systems adapt to changing environments, to changing economic and political and social conditions. All cultural systems change over time in response to shifts in context. Cultures change as they adapt to internal or external pressures. Cultures don't, however, all adapt to the same pressures in the same ways, and there do not seem to be any stages that all cultures naturally pass through. Culture adapts to changing conditions in a number of ways. Creativity is a fundamental human trait, and all societies have mechanisms for generating innovation from within. But at least equally important, if not more important, is the capacity of communities to borrow cultural innovations from other societies and adapt them to their needs or desires. The diffusion of ideas and technologies and practices occurs through direct content, such as migration or conquest, as well as through indirect contact, such as trade and mass media. It's important to recognize, though, that culture doesn't cease to be culture just because it borrows and adapts. When the Plains Indians adopted the horse and the rifle from the Spanish conquerors and traders and settlers, they completely transformed their society from a horticultural one to this nomadic warrior society. They did not, however, become Spaniards. Today, it's not uncommon to see McDonald's franchises in Cairo or New Delhi and to interpret them as evidence of an emerging global culture. But the McDonald's of Egypt is not the McDonald's of the United States. In the U.S., McDonald's is a low-status, inexpensive, and convenient restaurant designed to serve frantically busy lifestyles, low budgets, and the desire for places children can go with their parents. In Egypt, McDonald's is a high-priced, high-status restaurant that delivers food, caters parties, and is a favorite place for young cosmopolitan Egyptians to hang out. Although the restaurants share many of the same physical characteristics, these characteristics mean different things in their different contexts. Understanding how apparently identical things can mean can have very different meanings in different contexts is a really important aspect of good international studies. Okay, so I'm an anthropologist, and so far this has been sort of a long introduction to cultural anthropology by an anthropologist. So let's bring it home to international studies and specifically to policy analysis. And I want to argue that the anthropological perspective offers at least 5 key dimensions to broaden and deepen interdisciplinary policy research. First, anthropology emphasizes the importance of culture in explaining human actions at every level of society, from the interpersonal to the international. The concept of culture reminds us that people's symbolic worlds are just as real as the material conditions in which they live. In fact, people only apprehend the empirical world through learned models of reality. So while all people may respond to economic pressure and to military power, we can't begin to make accurate predictions about how they'll respond unless we have a thorough understanding of their cultural realities. Second, many contemporary approaches to international studies tend to write about cultures when they really mean communities or societies, or to somehow imagine that culture is contained by the lines on a map that demarcate the borders of states. The anthropological perspective can offer an important corrective to these tendencies to imagine nation-states as the only important locus of culture, and to identify or confuse symbolic systems with local groups, because it urges us to think of culture as a shifting and eminently practical set of resources that people use in making sense of the complex worlds in which they live. Third, anthropology urges us to remember that there are usually more than 2 points of view on any particular subject. Imagining the world in binaries is a deeply rooted part of the American and Western European cultural heritage. We divide the political world into left and right, and the economic world into socialist and free market, and we look for two sides to every story, and so forth. When we are faced with multiple perspectives on issues, we often lump them together into two opposed views. In doing so, we often miss really important differences between perspectives that seem trivial to us, but are matters of life and death for the people who hold them. Fourth, anthropology encourages us to sometimes think small. Dictators, presidents, ministers, ayatollahs, military commanders, these are not the only political actors who matter in the world. Political policies designed to bring dictators to heel may affect hundreds of thousands of people who have no say in how their states are run. Economic plans for increasing overall national economic growth may end up benefiting a small percentage of the population while increasing poverty among the majority. Military strategies designed to quickly overcome insurgent groups may so devastate bystanders as to create more people willing to join those kinds of groups. Rooted in on-the-ground empirical observation, anthropology encourages us to recognize the unintended outcomes of international actions on communities beyond their intended targets, and to consider how these will reshape the worldviews of members of these communities in their future encounters with us. And finally, anthropology emphasizes that international studies is always ultimately about people. It urges students and scholars and policymakers to learn from people, not just to learn about them. It urges us to recognize that the generation of similarities and differences is part of the human condition, and to seek to understand difference rather than fearing it or dismissing it, which are two very common, unfortunate tendencies in a lot of policy analysis approaches. Okay, so now it's time to print out the worksheet and ask yourself the key questions that we ask about all of these lessons. What did you find most interesting about this lesson on cultural perspectives? What question is uppermost in your mind after this lesson? And what impact might the ideas discussed in this lesson have on your project? And I will see you next class to discuss these.